A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're talking money again, and you might be curious as to what the election win for the Albanese government might mean for your finances in the coming term. Albo returned with an increased majority, and now there are a lot of promises to keep. Promises like the cost of living tax cuts, and there's $10 billion to build 100,000 homes. Hey, but only a 5% deposit required for first home buyers. Cutting 20% of HEX loans, $8.5 billion for Medicare, and more for expanding childcare. Well, we're also going to talk about our hip pocket and about the impacts of the global chaos that has accompanied the global Trump trade war. Finance expert Alex Cook is back with us. Alex is a former stockbroker. He's been a successful financial planner. He's the founder of Wealth with Purpose, and his ministry is about helping to equip Christians like you and me to honour God with our finances by teaching sound financial skills. Alex Cook, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be back again.
Alex, we always start our segments with something of an overview. And given we're, on the other side of the federal election now, there are all sorts of things that are going down internationally. Give us a little, perhaps it's in a nutshell, but your view of what's happening with markets and with economics. Hit us with your understanding.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I mean, the big thing since you and I caught up last time was the roller coaster. The roller coaster hit the stock markets. Many people would be aware of Donald Trump on the 2nd of April announced what was referred to as Liberation Day, where America was going to be set free. And essentially that involved an announcement of massive tariffs on the various countries importing into the United States. Now, what was unexpected was just the extent of them. So everyone knew tariffs was coming, but they thought it'd be fairly minor, but they were significantly higher than first expected. And so markets all of a sudden plummeted. I mean, they'd already been down a little bit over the previous month, but all of a sudden they plummeted 10%, within a space of 2 or 3 days. Interestingly, though, since then, Trump backed off. So a couple of days later, he announced that he was going to defer the tariffs for 90 days. And essentially all those losses, if you like, that 10% loss has all been wiped out and is back to roughly where it was. So markets are still down for the year, but overall nowhere near as much. So they bounced back dramatically. And there's all sorts of speculation as to why he did that. I mean, I suspect he probably didn't expect quite the reaction necessarily that it got. But the bigger thing is the bond market, and that's what most people ignore. Most people look at the stock market because it's much more volatile and it's much more, it makes much better news. But the bond market, the yields started to rise dramatically, and that was because, the impact of potential inflation from tariffs. And when bond yields rise, bond prices are falling. So it's actually quite a negative thing. And there's also some speculation as to, whether, those large holders of American debt like China and Japan were all going to start selling off their US holdings. So there's all sorts of speculation going on there. But the short thing is he quickly turned around, giving the realisation that markets were not liking what it was being sent their way. And of course, I think the big question that many countries are asking now, is America still a good long-term trading partner? Is it still our friend that we can trade with and so forth? I think the answer to that is very much yes. Everyone wants to tap the US consumer. Of every $10 spent, about $2.50 is spent by US consumers, and that's with only a population of 300 with 350 million. Compare that with Europe, who's got 450 million people, and people only spend on average about $1.25. So American consumers are far stronger than European, and everyone basically wants to have a piece of that market. So I don't think trade with the US is going to stop anytime soon, but it is certainly going to be a volatile time as these policies sort of work their way through the system. I don't think really anyone knows how they're going to play out. But I do think there is an end game in mind that Donald Trump has in mind, but we'll see what it's going to look like in due course.
And I guess Australia's film industry is now feeling a little bit of the effects of those extra tariffs, with 100% tariff likely to double the cost of making a movie here in Australia. But Donald Trump looking to defend the Hollywood film industry because it's the American film industry. You mentioned an end game. If you're talking big picture things here, the end game, is it a good game? Is it a bad game? We're all being affected by it. What do you think the end game is?
Yeah, look, I actually think it's much more positive for America than what people realise. I mean, the media is so hysterical towards Donald Trump that you're very hard pressed to find many good articles written about the guy. No wonder he's just as well he's made of steel, because he certainly cops a lot of criticism. But nonetheless, if you look at the end game and if you ask yourself what's he actually trying to achieve? So one thing is he wants to support US manufacturing, so he wants to prop that up back home, and in fact he wants to see things onshore. He wants to actually see supply chains come back to America. Now, keep in mind, if you're a CEO of a big company, tariffs is only one consideration. There's all sorts of other things like energy costs and regulations and other things that may impact your decision. But nonetheless, that's one of his goals. He wants to encourage exports and discourage imports into the US. He particularly wants to shrink their trade deficit, but he also wants to shrink their budget deficit because everyone knows America spends way more than it earns. And he wants to do that by raising revenue through tariffs. And he wants to defend unfair trade practices. And on that, he's got a point. Not everything China's done towards America has been fair. There's been talk for, people might remember when he was president last time, he always complained about China stealing America's trade secrets and things like that. So that's not unusual. But also I think with his tariffs, part of his strategy is this is just a negotiating tactic as well. But if you look at the end game, what he's doing actually makes some sense, what he's trying to achieve for the United States. The problem, of course, is, there are certain risks to doing it, and that's where I think that's where we don't know the real outcome here, because obviously there's retaliation, and so China's retaliated, as have some other countries. You're going to see higher prices in America, inflation. And what could be interesting for Australia is if China starts dumping its goods, if they can't send them to America, maybe they'll send more to Australia, and Australia will actually have a deflationary environment because we'll be flooded with lots of cheap Chinese goods. So there's all sorts of things that could happen. I mean, obviously recession, I think, is now a real risk, and you and I spoke about that previously. I think that was sort of on the cards already, and a destruction of demand, because if prices go up, people can't afford as much. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. I think it's all early days so far, and so uncertainty is the word of the day, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
What we might be interested in here, from our context, what are the implications here for Aussies with what's going on? These are big international challenges. What are the implications right here at home in our suburbs?
Well, most of the tariffs have a very minimal effect on Australia, because we only send about 4% of our exports to the US. So, whereas we send 30% to China. So in that sense, whilst the US is important, it's only a small piece of the pie. What I think is far more relevant to Australia is the impact that America has on China, which is, as I say, our number one trading partner. Is it going to cause a massive slowdown in China, where they're forced to find new customers for all their products rather than just the American consumer? And as I say, they end up flooding other countries with Chinese goods, which will be very deflationary, as I say, for Australia. But certainly I think that slowdown, I mean, China's already slowing down. It's got a real estate problem as well. I think that is a far bigger risk for Australia, more the indirect impacts of the tariffs than the tariffs themselves. Of course, that's also could be good for households in the sense that apart from cheaper goods, is rates are expected to fall further this year. And, there's a lot of people looking for mortgage relief, given how much debt Australians are up to, with the average home loan of $700,000 now. A bit of mortgage relief will go a long way. And so that could be one of the outcomes of all of this for Australians.
And, we talk about America and the impacts there, other impacts around the world and how that affects us here in Australia as well. What's going on in Europe. And a lot of people now are thinking about their own investment strategies and, where should I be putting some investments so that it can be in some ways protecting against some of the environment that's in such chaos around the world. Any brief overview there?
Yeah, well, look, in this sense, I'm still more positive on the US, far more so than Europe. Europe has succumbed to the very Marxist ideology over the last, 50-odd years, and it's in decline. Europe is very much in decline. As I say, the European consumer is far weaker and less relevant in global trade than the American consumer. But also Europe has, made a lot of decisions that will be very bad for them economically. People might remember, Europe is very green obsessed, right? It's very into the whole climate change thing. And people would probably be aware from the news last week that in Spain and Portugal, the entire grid went down for, the whole country blacked out. And this was literally only a week or so after they'd gone 100% renewable. So they're doing some crazy things over there. What should be a first world prosperous area is in decline. So I don't think Europe has the answer at all. And I think the politicians know it, and that's why they appear to be gearing up for war. If you look at what's happening in various countries there, like Poland is doubling their military, aiming to get to 500,000. Germany's now just located troops on the border at Lithuania. A number of them have announced conscription. Poland, for example, has announced that every adult male must be trained with military skills. So my nervousness is that Europe is gearing up for war, and obviously against Russia is what they're thinking. And so that will have profound implications for Europeans and obviously for the rest of the world as well. I really hope it simmers down. But if you look at when these things happen, one of the things you see is what we call money flows or capital flows. So gold, for example, is fleeing Europe and being sent by ship to America. So it's going to where it's deemed to be safer. And that's just some of the little trends that you see under the surface. And so Europe it's not in good shape at all. It's been living beyond its means for a long time as well, and very much a welfare state.
Visions 2020 with Neil Johnson, a biblical perspective on life, culture and current events.
Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316, or you can send us a text. Our text line 0447 488 316. Alex Cook is our guest, the founder of Wealth with Purpose. We've been doing a little bit of an update globally on what's happening economically. Let's talk about things that might be happening in the bank accounts and the investments of our listeners around the things that are going on globally, and on the fact that we've got a Labor government returned. There's all sorts of things to talk about there. But if you're worried about your own investment portfolio, or whether you've got a few dollars stashed, even if you've got something hidden underneath the mattress, what would you be doing with it right now? Because as listeners will be able to hear, there might not be easy times ahead. What are your thoughts for listeners about thinking about their finances, Alex?
Yeah, well, look, obviously, when you see this sort of market volatility rise dramatically as it has over the last month, people start to get nervous. Am I going to have enough money to retire on? Am I, where's this all heading? Are we going into a downturn? That kind of thing. But really, there's a number of good biblical principles, I think, that people can apply to their finances in general, but also especially more so relevant during this time. So, for example, we don't think of the Bible obviously as an investment book, but it's just full of wisdom on how to handle money. And one of those, particularly when we talk about investing, is the need to diversify. Now, a financial planner would say to you, don't put all your eggs in one basket, that kind of thing. But in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 11, verse 2, it says, invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8, because you do not know what disaster may come upon the land. Now, that seems to me to be extremely good advice. And it's also important advice because nobody actually knows the future. So, in the Bible, particularly when we see the end times, we can see that things will deteriorate, but no one knows exactly how things are going to play out. Often people come to me and say, Alex, what do you think? And I say, well, look, here's what I see as a couple of different scenarios, but I actually don't know how it'll play out, exactly, because if I did, I'd be a very rich man if that was the case. But the reality is you need to diversify because nobody actually knows. So that's the first one. The second one is debt, and this is the one, Neil, you and I have talked a lot about this over the years, and it's critically important that Christians, I think, really get away from our debt culture. Australia is the second most indebted households on earth. The average home loan now, it's mind-boggling at $700,000. And the Bible says the rich rules over the poor and the borrower becomes the slave of the lender. So my big concern has been for years, and even more so now, is that the average Aussie, and including the average Christian who follows worldly principles, will become enslaved. You end up spending all your money on, bank interest and taxes, and not have much left over for your family and for the kingdom of God. So that one is critical. The other thing is to save. It's important here to just save as you go along. Because then you've got money to invest, but also you have money for emergencies, and also you have money to take advantage of opportunities. I mean, people often get very nervous in these times, but the reality is they actually create opportunities. Asset prices fluctuate, they may come down, and you'll have an opportunity to buy good quality things for less. So, make sure you save some money, set some money aside both for a rainy day but also for opportunities. So there's some of the things people can do. And, of course, lastly, get advice. Don't feel you have to walk this alone. To reach out and talk to people, whether that's, people in your church where they've had some degree of success, or could be professional help like accountants and financial advisors, but talk to people and get the wisdom of many counselors, as Proverbs encourages us to do. It'll make life a lot easier for you.
Only a minute or two out from news, Alex. Let's just, for this next 60 seconds, for younger people, people who are, around their 30s, when they're thinking about, turbulence, what do I do? Any insights for younger people?
Yeah, look, I mean, for younger people, once again, this is where it becomes much more of an opportunity. I say to people to focus firstly on quality investments. And don't try and time it. Just keep adding money in over time. So there's a great strategy that we call dollar cost averaging, where you just keep adding money in month after month rather than trying to pick it. A lot of people think because they watch the news, if there's good news out there or bad news, often the bad news is actually the best time to buy, but it's the time when you often least feel like it, because psychologically markets have fallen, there's all this bad news, and people don't want to buy. So if you keep just adding in regularly into good quality investments, you'll find yourself doing really well over the long term. So the volatility is actually an opportunity for young people, not a negative. Whereas older people obviously have to be a bit more careful, have a bit more set aside in reserves for the rainy day, given they can't work and can't wait necessarily for it to recover, depending on their age and time frame.
Let's take a call. Richard's been waiting patiently in Alstonville in New South Wales. Hey, Richard, welcome along.
Hey, guys. I had two questions for you. I was listening to, I think is it Mark Bouris or Nick Bouris and Peter Dutton before the election on his podcast. Yep. And he was mentioning that Labor and Albanese have been looking at a futures tax on, say, your investments or capital gains or superannuation or anything at all. Have you heard about that? So they want to tax you now for the future.
Alex.
It's the most insane policy I've ever seen. I actually think it's deeply immoral. So what it is, and it won't affect most people initially, right? So what they want to do, and they announced it must be close to 2 years ago now, and that is that if your superannuation balance is $3 million or more, it will be taxed on unrealised gains at the end of the financial year. Now, that to me is a crazy policy because you've literally you haven't actually realised the gain. It's not crystallised. And so it'll create enormous messy reporting, and it'll also force people to sell things. But you'll be forced to sell assets that you don't want to sell in order to pay your tax bill. So it is absolutely crazy. I'm not aware of anyone else in the world who does it, but it has it's probably been tried before. But it's crazy. And the concern I have is that, let's say they go ahead with it, is it'll then extend they said they weren't going to index it, so it's not going to go up. What may happen is eventually, if they think it's giving them lots of money, they may even lower it, or they apply it to other things. So they might apply it to other assets that are unrealised gains. It's like the crazy wealth taxes many governments announce. They think, if we tax the billionaires 1%, but what they forget is most billionaires don't sit on lots of cash. Most of it invested in the companies that they spent their lifetimes building. And so then to pay that wealth tax, they're forced to sell down some of their holdings. And so an unrealised capital gains tax would do exactly the same thing. So look, I hope it never sees the light of day, but I think it's a crazy policy and sets a very bad precedent. So hopefully it won't happen.
Richard in Austinville, I want to thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line's open on 1800 316 316. I want to get into some of the fallouts and some of the implications of big promises that have been made by the Albanese government, because how might this affect our personal finances? Your insights here, Alex, into the re-elected Albanese government. What's that going to do for our finances?
Well, look, in one sense, it's more of the same. The last 3 years has been a period of an unprecedented drop in living standards. And probably the best measure for that is people's income per capita, right? So one of the things, or what I call real wages per capita. So even though people have experienced wage rises over the past 3 years, on a per capita basis, they've been the fastest drop in history. In fact, I suspect probably since they started recording it. And so as a result, most Australians, rightly, they feel poorer. And so one would expect, and so we've had 8 quarters of negative real capital wage growth, 8 quarters of negative, so essentially 2 years. And so I can't imagine that's going to bounce back much, if not everything, maybe it even falls further. So that's, to me, probably the number one concern I would have. But the other thing in re-electing this government, this is a government that has mass immigration. So over the last few years, I think we've brought in well over 1.5 million people over the past 3 years. Whilst they've said that they would reduce it, and the Liberal Party promised the same, both of them were, essentially dancing around the edges, so to speak, and in such a way that you know they're not serious about it. And both parties, not just Labor, are very nervous that if they were to cut immigration significantly, that it would trigger a recession, because there's just less people spending, right, in the economy, which is why they're both committed to doing it. But of course, the problem with mass immigration is it's feeding into our housing crisis. So, it's not going to help with the rental shortages, and it's not going to help with the already obscene pricing that people have to pay to buy a house. All those things are going to remain as problems and remain unaffordable because as I say, they're not going to cut to the core of the problem. So I think that's one. And in fact, if you look at the two biggest expenses that most people have, it's housing and energy. They're the two big ones. And of course, the Labor Party were committed to net zero under that when they got elected last time, and energy prices have skyrocketed since then. I can't see any reason why that's not going to continue. We keep getting fed the same nonsense that renewable energy is cheaper. And that may be true in the long run once all the infrastructure is in place, but you got to talk about enormous infrastructure investment to get you there. It's also not cheaper when you consider you have to store the energy. So you're going to have massive battery storage, because renewable energy is so unreliable and intermittent. And, if you want proof of that, just look at what happened in Spain and Portugal over the last 2 weeks with blackouts across the whole country. And I think Australians will be absolutely furious if we start to see blackouts as a common feature of our society. No one wants to go back into this sort of crazy third world mania. So I really hope some common sense returns to the table with all this, energy policies.
Alice,
it doesn't seem to be that case. I think they'll double down.
Alex, where so many listeners will be, the housing crisis. What are your predictions for what might be coming? You're suggesting that probably not much is going to change, but for those who are looking for a rental, and they're lining up with 30 or 50 other people just to put an application in, more of the same? Is this where you think we're headed?
I think so. So if you look at housing, both the major parties preach affordability, right? They say we want housing affordability while continuing to make them unaffordable through their policy. So, in fact, what was really interesting in this election, as people probably aware, the Greens went backwards significantly. They lost, I think, 2 seats, possibly even 3. And that was because they came out very hard saying, and if you saw Adam Bant was wearing a shirt saying we're here to help renters. And what's interesting, in Australia, a third of people own their own home outright. Another third own their home but with a mortgage, and a third of people rent. So in essence, two-thirds of Australians have a vested interest in house prices going up, not down. And so I think both the major parties know that. And so the Greens policies, which was end negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, that had a very negative impact on them. But what Labor announced prior to the election, and they did this during the budget, was that they were going to allow first home buyers to borrow with as little as 5%, which you can do now, but you have to take out what they call lender's mortgage insurance. But this time, the government, so taxpayers, are going to be on the hook for guaranteeing these loans. So to me, it's kind of creating like a subprime lending category in Australia, like what America did back during the GFC. So to me, that's a policy that's only going to drive prices higher. And the other thing Labor did, which once again will increase the amount of people that can buy, is they said that banks should ignore student debt. So if you've got a big debt from uni, the banks have been instructed to ignore that, and therefore obviously you can borrow more money. So those two policies alone, yes, in theory they help people by making more people available to buy a house, but it doesn't actually drive prices lower, it drives prices higher, making it more difficult to get in and more unaffordable. So I think that's not going to help anyone. The only possible relief from all the things going on is with the increased volatility in the world. Rates, may fall this year, and we'll see. That'll make things a bit easier for people as well. So
some might be asking, renters, Alex, whether this is actually
tough.
A good time to buy an investment property if these things are going to continue. Now, I'm actually on the side of the poor, and would like to see the poor or the young get into a first home. But some will be thinking,
me too.
What you're saying here, Alex, is that that these prices are going to continue to rise. So if I've got some money to invest, is the property market the way to go?
It's interesting. I think it based on these policies, it may rise a little. I think Australians are so stretched that I don't think there's much legs in it. But equally, I don't think it's going to collapse in a heap too, because they're just going to bring so many people into the country to prevent that from happening. But the question, is it a good time to buy, say, an investment property? I think when people look back in 10 years' time, it'll be seen for what it is, one of the biggest housing bubbles of all time. Housing in Australia at the moment, these are national figures as opposed to individual cities, because obviously individual cities can vary and there's a difference between urban and rural. But nationally, Australian housing's on 8 times income, which is double the long term. Long term is more like 4 times income. If you buy a home now on a median income into the medium household, mortgage repayments will be 51% of your income. And think about that implication, Neil, from the implication on churches and so forth. If the average Christian is paying 51% of their income on mortgage repayments, it's devastating long-term impact on the church. It also takes 11 years now to save for a deposit. Now, once again, that varies by city, but that's the national average. So to me, housing is so expensive that it's not worth looking at all from an investor's point of view. Because even though I don't think it'll necessarily collapse in a heap, because of, as I say, all the immigration, but I just can't see the upside over the long term when the valuations, the debt levels are all so extreme. They're so high.
Okay, so far as a property investment, take a little caution as you think about getting involved. But at the younger end of the market, if you're able to get into the market, perhaps is this a time to jump, to make that leap of faith, to be able to get your first property? Is this a time when you might be doing that at the early stage of your life?
Look, it's a great question. Look, I always judge it on individual circumstances. It's a difficult question to answer blanketly, because some people obviously get help from the bank of mum and dad. Some people have high incomes that they can support a high level of debt, or they're in occupations where they're likely to get promoted over time. So even though they might not have much income now, their income will grow over time. I think the main issue is that if you are going to buy now, that particularly for young people, I always say you want to buy on the basis, say you get married, you want to buy on the basis of one income, because, if you're young, you get married, baby may come along in the not too distant future after that, and all of a sudden you'll be under enormous pressure. And I think a lot of people are under that pressure, where both husband and wife both have to go off to work, even though there's a young family. So you've got to weigh up very carefully what sort of economic circumstances you're going to take yourself into by taking on a mortgage. Because as I say, house prices are so extreme. Do they fall in the next couple of years? Who knows? But on the balance of averages, with all this immigration, it's just going to make it tough for anyone wanting to get into the market for the time being.
Our talkback line open on 1-800 316 316. You can send us a text too, as an anonymous texter has said, takes us off in a little bit of a different direction, perhaps back to some ground we might have covered, but they're saying, how can I track the movement of gold? Is there a particular site, app? How do you track the movement of gold if you were considering investing in gold?
Great question. Look, there's lots and lots of ways. I mean, I personally use a website and an app called investing.com, and you can create a watch list of things that you want to follow. So I follow all sorts of things from stock indices, commodities, currencies, gold, etc. And you can just use an app and you can track it very easily. There's also, if you want to look at a lot of historical data and so forth, there's a great website called goldprice.org, and you can look at gold in different currencies. So you can look at it in Aussie dollars, you can look at it in US dollars, and so forth. So there's plenty of resources out there to track gold. Very easy.
Had a listener question come in just a few days ago. Let me just quickly reflect on it. It's a little bit lengthy, so just listen carefully. From Jeffrey in South Australia, who says, I've been filling in a Centrelink home care package form, SA456, calculation of cost of home care for aged care for my wife. Question 31 on that section says, in the 5 years before your application, have you and your partner given away or sold for less than the market value or surrendered a right to any cash, asset, property or income. Then there are explanations. Gifting is where you give away assets or transfer them for less than their market value. For example, if your partner give away, transfer a share in a private company, transfer your shares or your units in a trust or company and do not get full value for them. If you give up control of a trust or a company, if you own a property and sell it for less than it's worth, if you buy a car as a present, or if you have 10% of your wage donated to your local church, if you forgive a loan, if you have to pay a business loan because you guaranteed it, or you put money into a family trust and neither you nor your partner control that trust. He was suggesting that it seems very prejudicial to Christians who follow a biblical principle of tithing. Now, there's a lot in that, but a very brief response if you've got a response for Jeffrey in South Australia.
Probably two parts to the answer. First is just the general view of Centrelink. So historically, what used to happen is some people would give away their assets, and in particular, they would give assets to their children to get them out of their own name in order to attract a higher age pension, right? So the pension works on an assets test and an income test. So the lower your assets, the more higher a pension you're going to get. So I'm assuming, and that's what we call it deeming. So basically when you give the money away, the government subjects it to what's called deeming and assumes that you still have it. So I'm assuming with this home care package, they're trying to adopt a similar principle in that they don't want you to give away any of your assets in order to be able to make yourself more eligible for the home care package. That's what I assume that they're trying to prevent with this. But I find it fascinating that they include giving to a church on the form when you consider the fact that you don't personally or your own family benefit from it. So normally, as I say, people would give money to their children so that the money stays in the family, and so there's a real family benefit to it. Whereas in this case, if you've given money away to the church, you've given it away. You don't benefit from it anyway. So I'm staggered that that's included in there. Surprised even that the government even thinks about people giving 10% of their incomes to churches. So, yeah, it does appear prejudicial, whether that's intentional. But once again, it doesn't seem to me to make sense, given that the person who's giving the money away doesn't benefit, or nor do any of their direct family members. So it's an unusual one that's included. I'd love to know the thinking.
Hopefully that was helpful, Jeffrey. Another text question from this person who says, my wife and I would love to buy a home, but despite a substantial deposit, we've been edged out of the opportunity by absurd inflation and loans being limited due to our dependents, like 6 children. We do invest our finances on other options to gain a larger deposit and just wait it out. We want a home and future for our family. Any advice on investments, etc., would be great. Have you got a response for that, texter?
Yeah, look, it's hard to answer, but the point they've made is a genuine one, and that is that the more dependents you have, that adds into the servicing calculator. So banks, when they determine how much they'll lend you, they'll look at it and say, how many children are you raising? Because that obviously costs a lot of money to raise kids. And so for every child that you have, it lowers your borrowing capacity. And so that's the problem they've stumbled upon, which, as I say, is not unsurprising. To be fair to the bank, they've obviously got to take into account genuine people's living expenses. The more kids you have, the more it costs. I've got 4, so I know all about it. But in terms of, where should you invest between now and then, to me, the key, and look, I think house prices are going to start to plateau out, even though I think these crazy policies will keep them propped up. I don't think they can go up much more. I think the average Aussie is just so over-indebted. I think if you just keep building up your deposit, keep building up your savings, you won't have to wait too long to eventually be able to get into the market. Keep talking to mortgage brokers and assess your servicing capacity. Because, as I say, the rules keep changing on that, and the government is trying to make it easier with the current policies. Even though I don't agree with them, they're certainly trying to make it a little bit easier for first home buyers. So yeah, there's a few little tidbits, but I think you just you got to keep building your savings nest egg, and don't borrow too much money when you get the opportunity.
Alex, time's almost run out. So with the global uncertainty, the turmoil, even the chaos that's going on, with the things that are continuing here in Australia, and it does appear that there's not a lot of solutions. There's a lot of handouts with the new government elected, the continuing Albanese government. If you're a Christian believer and you're thinking, well, how should I respond? Hearing some of the things that you've been sharing over this past hour, as a Christian, what do you do? How do you respond? Is there something immediate you can apply to your own way of thinking about your finances that might take you forward with some wisdom?
Absolutely. Look, I think, the obvious thing is pray. Pray in two ways. We need to pray for good governance. I think most of the Western world has, wandered way off the biblical path for the last 50 years. It's not something that's happened overnight. It's happened over a long period. And so we need to pray for good governance, for good leaders, and for wisdom for those who, if you like, rule over us to make good decisions. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, I think, is to align your own finances with God's word and develop what I call a stewardship mentality. I think because I meet lots of Christians, I talk to them about their finances. The one thing I often find is they still too much operate under the world's principles and the world's way of thinking. So when they talk to me, for example, about their financial goals, quite often those goals are just as like anyone else from the world. I think as Christians, we need to start. The Bible tells us we've got to be in the world, but not of the world. And I think that's got to apply to our finances. We've got to be in it, but we can start doing things differently. We need to get away from this materialism. We need to focus more on being content, more on sowing into eternal things, rather than, loading ourselves up on debt and just being like everybody else. I think now we're living in this season where things are deteriorating around the Western world. Now is an opportunity for us to do things differently, to live more generously, to help those in need, to have that outward focus on others rather than just the inward focus on ourselves. I'm not saying we don't look after, obviously, our own families and those things, which are all very important, but more that we start to have this outward focus and a kingdom focus on how we think about money and what we're going to do with it, rather than getting caught up in the worldly mindset that is so easy to do and very easy in a nation like Australia.
I guess what you do with your finances is one of those outward displays of how you give glory to God. And so I guess how you handle 100%. Your finances, that stewardship mentality, as you say, is going to be very important. And to apply those, and that's not rocket science, is it? There are some pretty sound biblical principles on which you can adjust your thinking about finances. And if you'd like to connect with Alex, you can do. He has a website, wealthwithpurpose.com. I mentioned earlier his ministry is to help equip Christians to honour God with their finances by teaching sound financial skills. So wealthwithpurpose.com, there's free ebooks, the My Toolkit, free videos, there's podcast content there. You can follow Alex on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, X. You can also send Alex an email, askalex@wealthwithpurpose.com. Alex, always good getting your insights. Thanks so much for joining us today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.